Discussing King Kong vs. Godzilla naturally takes us back to the 1933 film, which wowed the world and introduced a timeless cinematic legend. The image of the mighty ape atop the Empire State Building, clutching a damsel in distress while swatting at airplanes, is one of the most famous images throughout film history. The triumph of that film is unquestionably attributable to the special effects that made it happen. While Merian Cooper was responsible for the concept, the ability to bring Kong to life in so believable of a way is what made that film stand the test of time. Willis O'Brien's career reached its zenith with this monster. King Kong was his triumph. It was also the point when everything started to go wrong. Professionally, Kong's success brought him acclaim, and he was to receive an Academy Award for his work on it. But O'Brien felt he couldn't have done it without the talented and hard-working team behind him, and wanted to ensure that they would all be able to receive an award. When the Academy said that they wouldn't, O'Brien said that he would refuse any reward then. This snubbing of the Oscars would not go unpunished. If he refused their highest accolade, he wasn't really one of them, was he? He wasn't really part of Hollywood. So O'Brien languished under a reputation as an unreliable eccentric, too flighty to risk money on backing. Personally, the worst kind of tragedy also struck him at this time. His ex-wife had cancer and TB. The tuberculosis also blinded his son, William. While his relationship with his wife was rocky, reports are that the marriage had been forced on him, and O'Brien's behavior had exacerbated his wife's mental problems. But he loved his boys, William and Willis Jr., dearly. He even brought them to where he was working on the rushed, inferior sequel, Son of Kong, where they could enjoy the cool toys that were being used by the pioneering animators. Sadly, weeks later his wife had a complete breakdown, murdering both boys before turning the gun on herself. Ironically, the act saved her life because the bullet would drain her lung. But O'Brien was emotionally devastated and his career was damaged. But Merian Cooper, who conceived of the Kong project, continued to employ O'Brien in his work. Until, that is, something rather unexpected happened. The Japanese launched an attack against Pearl Harbor. The reason the Pearl Harbor attack is relevant actually goes back more than a century and a half. Merian Cooper's great-great-grandfather was John Cooper, who fought in the American Revolution, and had been befriended by Count Pulaski, who had come to America to help the young country secure its freedom. Pulaski's heroism left a strong impression upon John, who would be the one to personally pull the mortally wounded Pulaski off the field of battle in 1779. And Pulaski would become a legend within the Cooper family for generations. Cooper fought in World War I as a pilot. In fact, he would actually make an appearance in Kong in a biplane. But after it was over and Poland had become independent of Russia, Cooper wanted to pay back what Pulaski had done for his family and country, and so he stayed in Europe, helping first with food administration in Poland. Well, Lenin wanted to reconquer some of the lost territory, which included Poland. And so, Cooper formed a group of American volunteers to fight for Poland's independence the same way that Pulaski had fought for theirs. The group's efforts weakened the forces enough that the Polish military was able to rout the Soviet invaders and win the war. During the war, Cooper was shot down, actually, faced a mock execution squad, which is a war crime, and then escaped the POW camp, and after being decorated by Poland for his heroism, he returned to America, where he would eventually conceive of King Kong. In 1941, the Battle of Britain showed that amongst the brave pilots that were the last holdout against the fascists spread across the continent, there was a royal contingent of the 303, the Polish pilot division that had been birthed by him and his volunteers more than 20 years earlier. He was both proud and moved. And so, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, well, you would think that of all people, the 48-year-old Cooper would be the one who could say, "No thank you, I've done this twice already." But with that still fresh in his mind, he went out and re-enlisted. He was made a colonel, and not only was responsible for many coordinated operations, but still personally flew planes at the age of 50 to deliver much-needed supplies to the Chinese front. and later on participated in 9 combat missions. Because of his contributions to the defeat of the Japanese air forces, he was not only eventually promoted to the rank of general, but was personally present on the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, where he was able to personally witness the official surrender of Japan. That surrender may have been a grim day for much of Japan, but there was one person who was on that side that was probably only too happy to see it, and that was Shinichi Sekizawa. He was the polar opposite of Cooper in just about every way conceivable. He was a young man at the very start of his career. He was studying animation alongside the famous manga artist Osamu Tezuka. When the war came, he didn't rush out to sign up. He was drafted. He wasn't planning and organizing and winning accolades either. He got stuck in some godforsaken island in the ass end of nowhere. He was hot, starved, drenched in humidity, and surrounded by irritating bugs every moment of the day. To put it bluntly, Sekizawa was the most miserable bastard in the Pacific, at least as far as anyone within earshot of him could say. When he finally was allowed to go home, Sekizawa was a changed man. From living on the miserable islands, with his every moment being controlled by his surly superiors, he was finally a free man, and he was committed to living his life to the fullest. He sought joy in everything he did, and operated without the brooding political issues of his contemporaries. Some of them wanted to push a communist agenda, for instance, but his exception was mostly just for greed and short-sightedness in capitalism, rather than dismissing the entire concept of it. Really, just about the only thing that politically pissed him off was Japan's own imperialism, which stuck him on that damned island in the first place. He would, in fact, make a habit of having strange and awful things happen on remote islands in his films, drawing on his view of them during the war that basically tiny islands are places where terrible things are always happening. On returning, he quickly took his film career in a new direction as a writer, turning a finished script in for the film Profile of the City in a mere 4 days. He moved into science fiction and both wrote and directed a film called, roughly translated, Fearful Attack of the Flying Saucers. With his sci-fi chops down, he was asked to develop a science fiction series for television, and it was called Aegon the Atomic Dragon, a series about a giant monster. A monster that was realized by Suitmation. That was atomic. That was reptilian. That could breathe fire. If you're thinking, that sounds like a shameless Godzilla ripoff, you don't know the half of it. Toho definitely thought that they had crossed a line there, got the whole thing shut down. But with his chops and the fear that he might start creating something that would be a viable threat, Toho decided the safest course of action was to just hire them for themselves, which was how he came to work on a little picture called Varan. Or at the very least, it was supposed to be a little picture. By now, it's no doubt time to get back to Tanaka and company, considering how they are integral to Godzilla. And that wasn't really a problem for him. Tanaka didn't mind that he and the other creators behind Godzilla had such a strong tie to monster films. And after Godzilla raids again, they had quickly gone on to Rodan, which we'll get to at a later time. But it was after Rodan that this thing that he was yoked to took him where he didn't want to go. Backwards. Godzilla King of the Monsters was a huge success on television in America, and ABPT came to Tokyo wanting to co-produce another film specifically for television. ABPT was tied to the ABC network, actually. By this time, both color and widescreen had become the standard in Japanese cinema. But the Godzilla that everyone was watching was a black and white piece with an aspect ratio that fit television sets of the time. The new film that Toho agreed to would have to be done that way, and it was called Varan. And for these and other reasons, they did their jobs but were inclined to just phone it in, drawing on Godzilla and Rodan for the story. Even the fastidious Tsuburaya was willing to just reuse old footage and cut corners. It was, after all, not going to be blown up on a big screen. It was going to be on tiny American televisions. Well, you might recall the name ABPT from my discussion of Godzilla Raids Again. They were the ones who were going to recut that movie into the volcano monsters, remember? But wait, wasn't it actually released as Gigantus the Fire Monster because ABPT went out of business? Yep. They had essentially wanted to recut a movie for the cinemas, but had also wanted to have another film directly for television. But instead of that ambition, the company went belly up. Gigantus gave us the only film where a kamikaze was performed by Yogi Bear, and Toho was stuck with a partially finished Varan. Tanaka was given the choice: abandon the picture and lose all that had been invested in it, or just finish the film and release it to Japanese theaters. He decided on the latter, although that wasn't without its own problems. By now the ubiquity of widescreen had taken hold, and while they could slide by with a black and white film, they couldn't with a 4:3 film. But because it had been shot that way, the only choice was to crop the top and bottom off the pictures to create the widescreen, which really irritated Tsuburaya. Not only were his effects now going to be on a big screen instead of a tiny one, but by cropping it, they were blowing it up even further. Tsuburaya was basically just going through the motions. Honda is described as practically sleepwalking through his directing, and the plotline's mindless rehash of Godzilla and Rodan was seen for the laziness that it largely was. Only two things about the film would prove truly noteworthy. One was the soundtrack by Ifukube, which made use of and was inspired by Anu film music, and the other was the writing by Sekizawa. While they had the pedestrian plotline, he had worked to provide the piece with interesting, quirky characters and funny and clever dialogue. In keeping with his life choice to embrace joy, he fully embraced the monster movies that he was given and decided to just have as much fun with them as humanly possible. To do that, he wanted to shake things up, and he'd get a chance on his next picture. After Varan had come a film idea that seemed a pretty tough sell. It involved a dangerous giant moth. It was an adaptation of a serialized novel called The Luminous Fairies and Mothra. Despite the serious challenges that such a concept presented, Mothra was precisely the premise that Sekizawa needed, and he managed to transform this character from another ridiculous kaiju and into one of the most famous monsters of all time. Mothra, it has been argued, might just be the seminal work of Sekizawa, because it dovetailed with his plan to shake these films up. The plots of these films had become predictable, so he wanted to solve that by destroying the rules of the game, basically. He didn't want the film to be about the humans reacting to the monsters. He felt that was passé. No. He wanted films where the monsters were reacting to the people. The drama the humans were getting up to would wind up being resolved by the monsters in the end. In Mothra, rather than finding a weakness in the monster and destroying it, the humans would realize they should just let it have what it wants and then it will leave them alone. The real enemy in the film wasn't the monster, it was the greedy human who would ultimately get his comeuppance. Honda was fully on board with this idea. Monsters are not evil by choice, he said. They're born too tall, too strong, too heavy. That is their tragedy. They do not attack humanity intentionally, but because of their size, they cause damage and suffering. Therefore, man defends himself against them. After several stories of this type, the public finds sympathy for the monsters. In reality, they favor the monsters. Mothra also continued his trend from Varan by injecting humor, intentional humor I mean, into the film. The character Bulldog, for instance, who is frequently compared to Sekizawa himself, is frequently involved in slapstick, and the wit of Varan returns here. While Mothra does cause destruction and death in the film still, her behavior is, in the end, accepted by the audience as a consequence of the intrusion into her island, where she was worshipped as a god. Just like King Kong, actually. Speaking of which, we should probably check in on O'Brien. Well, by now O'Brien was in a real fix. Despite the universal acclaim for his work on King Kong, he went from one problem to the next. Cooper had at least been managing to get him some more projects to work on with him, but it was in the middle of their work on the film War Eagles that Cooper had left Hollywood to go help save the world. With Cooper gone and damage to his reputation, O'Brien went from one failed project to the next. He tried to get RKO to produce his film about cowboys encountering prehistoric creatures, but the rodeo with dinosaurs, as RKO described it, was rejected. It wasn't until the end of the decade, when Mighty Joe Young came along, that he finally caught a break, and this time he accepted the Oscar when it was offered to him. But O'Brien just wasn't very good at selling people on his ideas. Cooper got him a job at Cinerama, but he just couldn't seem to find a way to get his projects made. A string of small-scale stuff followed, like The Black Scorpion, seen on Season 1 of Mystery Science Theater 3000, and work with Ray Harryhausen on a couple of projects helped out too, but O'Brien found the greatest indignity when he was brought in for a remake of his own classic, The Lost World. However, Irwin Allen decided that, rather than having the maker of the greatest stop-motion film of all time use stop-motion animation, that the dinosaurs would be lizards with fins on them. Needless to say, O'Brien was not happy with this arrangement. Finally, O'Brien decided to try to go back to where his career was on top, with King Kong. Cooper had spoken about maybe even doing a widescreen remake of it, but that didn't get off the ground. So O'Brien wrote a sequel, King Kong vs. Frankenstein. Don't worry, it's not what you think. It's not the Boris Karloff character who would wind up frequently matching up with other monsters. No, the idea here was that this was the grandson of the original Dr. Frankenstein, and he has created this new monster out of animals like elephants and rhinos, and King Kong would wind up fighting this abomination in San Francisco. And in the end, both would plummet off the Golden Gate Bridge. O'Brien sold the idea to John Beck, who liked it, but he felt it needed a lot of work. He brought in George Yates, creator of the famous Ant film Them, to redo the script. But even after getting Yates on board, he just couldn't get anyone interested in the project in the US. Finally, Beck decided to try to get the film made in Japan, King Kong vs. Ginkgo, the name of the monster. Being a giant monster movie, Toho accepted and offered the project to Tanaka. He agreed to do it, but he wanted to change the script again, and also, he didn't like Ginkgo. He wanted to replace it with, yes, Godzilla. The famous reptile would go up against his cinematic ancestor. Godzilla had been literally on ice for 7 years now, but thanks to this King Kong project, he was coming back just in time for Toho's 30th anniversary celebration. Godzilla would be in full color and widescreen now, even if his opponent was getting top billing. The team that worked on Varan was now reassembled, including Ifukube, to provide the music, turning in what is generally considered to be the best score of his career, a powerful sound that complemented the clash between these two titans, in both stature and reputation. For the island, he repeated his technique from Varan, drawing musical inspiration from the Anu peoples for the chants that the villagers would use to call out to their god, Kong. There was, however, one big problem going on, and that was racism. In Japan, the Anu are an aboriginal group that were subjugated for much of Japan's history. Anu were considered dirty, primitive, near throwbacks by Japanese society. This has become a source of shame for modern Japan, with efforts to try to rectify some of those mistakes. I bring this up because, for this very reason, Varan has been edited in recent years because of some of the Anu performances that were seen as being so stereotypical and offensive that they had become embarrassing now. In fact, you may recall me mentioning previously of Honda's The Abominable Snowman, which was re-edited in America as half-human. Well, the depiction of the villagers in that film, unnamed but clearly intended to be either Anu or Burakumin, who were also subjugated, was really, really offensive, to the point that the only copy you can find out there, if you can even find it at all, has the timecode stamp on it because it was taken from a screener copy illegally. Toho has done a full Song of the South on that film, locking it in the vault and keeping it there out of fear that they'll invite not unjustified protests if they release it. By the time work came around for King Kong vs. Godzilla, it had been realized they needed to perhaps pull away from the depictions of the Anu and do what they could do to avoid any racist imagery. So they opted to have the natives all in blackface. Kind of like twisting your plane to avoid hitting pelicans only to fly it into the side of a mountain, huh? Godzilla would again need a new suit, especially for his first full-color appearance, and it was a hit. The King Kong costume, though, not so much. It was far more primitive a suit than Godzilla's was, with a mask that offered no facial expressions, and unlike Godzilla, looked exactly like a man wearing an ape costume. It's believed that the costume designer actually just took the monster suit that had been used in The Abominable Snowman and just made it a bit more monkey-like, but its deficiencies are glaring and undermine the top-billed character in the film. In some particular shots, it's clear that the costume has deteriorated, possibly from its time in storage since The Abominable Snowman. It was just one more problem for Tsuburaya, as King Kong vs. Godzilla would require a number of complex effects in addition to all of his usual model work, and color is a lot less forgiving for mistakes than black and white. But one thing the situation would allow for would be Sekizawa to even further develop his idea of the film, with the humans driving the plot and the monsters reacting to it, as well as a chance to inject some humor. Like with Mothra, a greedy businessman was going to be at the heart of this, responsible for bringing Kong to Japan in the hopes that he could serve as an advertising spokesman. And in keeping with the title, people can't help but see this in terms of a wrestling match, despite the stakes or seriousness of the situation. The military personnel present grudgingly admit that they've been placing bets on who was going to win in a fight. The horror of the destruction was out, and the revelry of it and the fighting was now in. And given Sekizawa's comedy aspects, Godzilla was now a far different kind of film than the allegory that he'd begun as. Sekizawa's humor was a big hit in Japan, but there was a problem for John Beck. It just didn't cross the cultural barrier between Japan and the United States. There was no way this film was going to work in America as it was. Thus, the film would be substantially reworked, with additional material added just like in King of the Monsters. Thomas Montgomery was hired to be the film doctor, who in addition to re-editing the film, turned the social satire of the original into broad comedy. They also took a page from King of the Monsters and thought maybe having a reporter character, one who provides the noir-inspired narration, could help. But the reporters in the film are instead shown doing actual broadcasts, and they're presenting information that they couldn't possibly know. Oftentimes the things they said were contradictory, and material that was previously established was disregarded. For instance, Godzilla is said to have been frozen since the age of dinosaurs, rather than by what happened in Godzilla Raids Again /Gigantus. Except upon the first sight, everybody knows that he is Godzilla, so they have to be familiar with the monster. The result of these changes was a film all the worse for its transformation, and critics savaged it, using it as an indictment of monster films when their criticisms were all solely of the inferior film that Beck had put out. In fact, the changes were so stark that there was a long-standing myth about the ending of King Kong vs. Godzilla. Film historian David Callett tracks the likely origin of the rumor back to a comment that Honda had made on the set of Kong vs. Godzilla, being a kind of proxy between the United States and Japan. And so the myth, likely first presented in the magazine Famous Monster of Filmland, says that the American version of the film ends with Kong as the victor, while in Japan, Godzilla is the victor. This might have seemed rational given Honda's comment and the long string of pictures with Godzilla as the hero, but this was still relatively early in Godzilla's career, when he was still the villain. A victorious Godzilla meant that he was now free to run amok and destroy Japan after all. Nevertheless, the myth so gained traction that even the New York Times repeated it in 1995. Even if he was the heel in this matchup, Godzilla was back, and the ending deliberately left open that he might have survived the battle and could one day be seen again. And what's more, the film was a smash hit, and the realization dawned. What people really want to see isn't just one giant monster, but two famous monsters going against each other, to have good versus bad, or even bad versus worse. Godzilla would remain the villain for his next matchup as well, Mothra, and Sekizawa was having a grand old time. While Kimura had admitted that kaiju films were a chore for him to do, Sekizawa said he thought they were a lot of fun and unabashedly said so when asked if he was really enjoying working on these films. The allegory was gone now. It was jokes and matchups and outlandish plots for the future of the series. This leads to a bit of a dilemma for fans of speculative fiction in general, and kaiju in particular. We have long seen the genre and subgenre maligned, treated as unsophisticated childish diversion and not in any way respectable art. As I said elsewhere, dismiss Citizen Kane and you are, well, rightly, told that you just don't have the sensibility to appreciate good cinema. The original Godzilla film challenged all of that. An unquestioned science fiction and monster film that nevertheless had pathos, asked hard questions, and showed many strata of humanity. Godzilla is what we can point to and say, you're all wrong. This is a giant monster smashing a city, and god damn it, it's art. The Rush sequel tried to be an allegory, but it stumbled as an effective war picture. It was when he was fighting against King Kong. It was with the zaniness introduced by Sekizawa that the monster turned into a franchise and became often camp or silly. They took a symbol of atomic devastation and they turned him into an amusing character. Yet this kind of Godzilla took off in popularity because this kind of movie was just a great experience. Hence the dilemma. How can you defend something that does such a disservice to taking kaiju seriously, and yet how can you attack it without in the end becoming those critics who turn their noses up at the films because they have the audacity to actually be fun? I mean, you don't have to necessarily defend the terrible, but maybe you can resist the urge to lump others in simply because they go for the lighthearted. Yes, it can lead to cases of disrespect like Godzilla 1985 showed when it didn't realize that kaiju could be taken seriously and not camp. But shouldn't we in the end say, Godzilla was a great allegory of a film, but the series has become something else, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if anyone says otherwise, maybe just say to them, you just don't have the sensibility to appreciate good cinema. But let's take a look at the film itself. Here's King Kong vs. Godzilla.